The morning rush at Molly's diner had finally died down. Shanice wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand as she refilled the coffee pot. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, the same pair she'd been wearing for nearly 2 years now. New shoes would have to wait, just like many other things in her life. Nursing school tuition came first. "Order up," yelled Frank from the kitchen, his voice carrying over the oldies music playing from the small radio by the register. Shanice grabbed 2 plates of scrambled eggs and hash browns, balancing them expertly on her arm as she had done thousands of times before. At 26, she'd mastered the art of waitressing, though it had never been her dream job. It was a stepping stone, a way to support herself and her daughter while building toward something better. "Here you go, folks. Anything else I can get for you?" she asked with a genuine smile that reached her tired eyes. The elderly couple thanked her warmly. They were regulars who always left her a generous tip, knowing she was working her way through school. As the lunch hour approached, Shanice glanced at her watch. She had another 6 hours to go before she could pick up her daughter from her neighbor's apartment. Double shifts were brutal, but Thursdays and Saturdays were when she made her best tips. Every extra dollar meant one step closer to finishing her nursing degree. "You look dead on your feet, honey," said Helen, the 60-year-old hostess who had taken Shanice under her wing when she started at Molly's 3 years ago. "Take 5 minutes in the back. I'll cover your tables." Shanice nodded gratefully. In the cramped break room, she pulled out her nursing textbook. 5 minutes wasn't much, but she'd learned to study in these stolen moments, waiting for orders during short breaks, late at night after putting her daughter to bed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter's teacher. "May needs to bring $15 for the field trip tomorrow." Shanice sighed. Another unexpected expense. She'd have to skip lunch again today to make it work. At 5 years old, May didn't fully understand why they couldn't afford certain things, but she never complained. She was a bright spot in Shanice's demanding life, the reason she pushed herself through exhaustion day after day. The diner door chimed as she returned to the floor. A businessman in an expensive suit took a seat in her section, already talking loudly on his phone. Shanice approached with a menu and water, but he barely acknowledged her presence, continuing his conversation about golf memberships and stock options. "I'll give you a minute," she said quietly, though she doubted he heard her. The lunch rush filled the diner with the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation. Shanice moved efficiently between tables, remembering everyone's orders without writing them down. Regular customers greeted her by name, asking about May and her studies. These small connections made the hard work a little easier to bear. "How's that nursing program coming along?" asked Mr. Rivera, a retired teacher who came in every Thursday for the meatloaf special. "Slowly but surely," Shanice replied, refilling his water. "2 more years if I can keep up with the night classes." "You'll make it," he said confidently. "My wife was a nurse for 40 years. Best profession there is." These words of encouragement meant more to Shanice than anyone knew. There were nights when exhaustion nearly broke her resolve, when the balance of work, motherhood, and education seemed impossible to maintain. During a rare quiet moment, she sat at the counter to rest her legs and check May's homework from the previous night. Helen slid a plate of fries toward her. "Eat something. You're getting too skinny." "I'm saving for." "I know what you're saving for," Helen interrupted. "But you can't help anyone if you collapse. Now eat." The afternoon stretched on as rain began to patter against the windows. Shanice gazed outside, watching people hurry past with umbrellas and raincoats. The diner had emptied out, and she used the time to wipe down menus and refill condiments. She thought about May, who would be drawing pictures at Ms. Patel's apartment next door. May wanted to be a doctor someday. "I'll make people better, just like you will, Mommy," she often said. The thought warmed Shanice's heart as thunder rolled in the distance. Little did she know that the coming storm would bring more than just rain through the diner's door. Her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The rain came down harder as evening approached. Shanice watched through the steamy windows as people rushed by, hunched under umbrellas or holding newspapers over their heads. The dinner crowd would be thin tonight with weather this nasty. "Looks like we might close early," Frank called from the kitchen as he wiped down the grill. Tuesdays were always slow, and the storm made it worse. Only 3 tables were occupied. a young couple sharing a milkshake in the corner booth, an older woman slowly working on a slice of apple pie, and a truck driver finishing his burger before hitting the road again. Shanice was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled. A gust of wet wind blew in, along with a man who seemed to bring the very essence of hardship with him. He stood just inside the entrance, water dripping from his worn jacket onto the checkered floor. His clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, and his grey beard was untrimmed. But it was his eyes that caught Shanice's attention, deep-set and weary, yet somehow still alert, taking in the room with a cautious gaze. Helen approached him first. "Table for one, sir?" The man nodded stiffly, his movements mechanical and precise despite his disheveled appearance. Helen led him to a small table in Shanice's section, handed him a menu, and gave Shanice a subtle nod. Something in Helen's expression told Shanice this customer needed special attention. "I'll be right with you," Shanice called over with a friendly smile. The man didn't look up, his focus entirely on the laminated menu he held in weathered hands. As Shanice approached his table, she noticed how he sat ramrod straight despite his apparent exhaustion. It reminded her of her grandfather when he'd visit years ago. That military posture never quite leaves a person. "Ready to order?" she asked gently. The man cleared his throat. "Just coffee, please. And maybe some toast, if that's not too much trouble." His voice was quiet but clear, with a hint of a southern drawl. "No trouble at all," Shanice replied. She watched as he carefully emptied the contents of a plastic shopping bag onto the table, loose change, mostly pennies and nickels, with a few quarters mixed in. His fingers, marked with old scars and calluses, meticulously arranged the coins into small piles. "This should cover it," he said, without meeting her eyes. "And I won't take up the table long, I promise." Something tightened in Shanice's chest. She recognized the calculations of someone counting every cent, the quiet dignity in his voice as he tried to maintain his pride. She'd been there herself too many times. As she walked back to get his coffee, she noticed more details, a military tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, the way he scanned the room like someone used to looking for exits, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of more than just age. When she returned with his coffee and toast, she added a small bowl of soup. "I didn't order that," he said, looking up at her properly for the first time. His eyes were a faded blue, lined with years of sun and worry. "It's on the house," Shanice said. "We've got extra today. Would be a shame to waste it." The lie was small and kind. The soup would come out of her tips, but the flash of gratitude in the man's eyes was worth it. "Name's James," he offered after taking a careful sip of the hot soup. "James Wilson." "Shanice Taylor. Nice to meet you, James." She noticed how he wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, savoring the warmth. His boots, though muddy now, had once been military issue. The way he'd arranged his napkin and spoon showed habits formed long ago. The diner had emptied out even more, with only the couple remaining, lost in their own world. Frank had the radio on low, an old song from the 70s, playing softly beneath the sound of rain hitting the windows. Outside, the streets glistened under the streetlights. "Bad night to be out there," Shanice commented, glancing toward the window. James nodded. "Had worse." He took a careful bite of toast. Vietnam had rain that would make this look like a sprinkle. And there it was, the confirmation of what she'd suspected. Shanice thought of her grandfather's stories, the photographs he kept in an old cigar box, the nightmares that had plagued him until his final days. "My grandpa served in Vietnam," she said, 101st Airborne. James looked up, a new interest in his eyes. 5th Infantry Division, myself. A connection formed in that moment, a thread linking Shanice to this stranger through memories of a man she had loved and lost. She wanted to ask more, but a customer waved for their check, and she had to step away. When she returned, James had nearly finished his soup, eating with the careful precision of someone who knew hunger too well. He pushed his coffee cup to the edge of the table, an unconscious signal for a refill that spoke of diner habits from decades past. As Shanice refilled his cup, she noticed him wince slightly when he shifted in his seat. "You okay?" she asked. "Old injury acts up in the rain," he said dismissively. "Nothing to fuss about." But Shanice saw how he held himself, protecting his left side. She saw too the way his eyes kept drifting to the window, measuring the storm, calculating his next move. She realized with a pang that he probably had nowhere dry to go when the diner closed. What she didn't see was Tom Peterson, a middle-aged man sitting quietly in the corner booth, watching their interaction with growing interest. Tom had come in just after James, taking a seat in Helen's section, and had been observing them while pretending to read a newspaper. The rain continued to beat against the windows as the night grew darker, and James Wilson nursed his coffee, making it last as long as possible, each sip measured and deliberate, like a man buying time against an approaching deadline. The clock on the wall ticked past 8. Frank had already cleaned most of the kitchen, and Helen was counting the register. The young couple had left, hurrying through the rain to their car. Only James remained, staring into his coffee cup as if searching for answers in the dark liquid. Shanice should have been eager to close up and head home to May, but something about the old veteran kept her hovering nearby. She'd called her neighbor, Mrs. Puttoll, to ask if May could stay a bit longer. No rush, Mrs. Puttoll had assured her. She and my grandson are building a fort with blankets. The diner was quiet now, just the sound of rain and distant thunder. Tom Peterson still sat in the corner booth, occasionally glancing up from his newspaper. Shanice barely noticed him as she wiped down nearby tables, keeping within talking distance of James. "More coffee?" she offered, pot in hand. James looked up, hesitating. "I don't want to keep you folks." "We're open till 9, Shanice lied. They actually closed at 8 on Tuesdays, but Frank and Helen exchanged knowing looks and said nothing. James nodded his thanks as she refilled his cup. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it. "Cold night," Shanice said, sliding into the seat across from him. Her feet throbbed with relief at finally sitting down. "Been through worse," James replied, but gratitude flickered across his weathered face. "My grandpa used to say that too. No matter what happened, he'd been through worse in Nam." Shanice wrapped her hands around her own cup of coffee. Her break had ended an hour ago, but the diner was empty enough that no one minded. A small smile cracked through James's serious expression. "Your grandpa sounds like a wise man." He was, stubborn as a mule, but wise. Shanice smiled at the memory. "He raised me after my mom passed. Taught me everything important, how to change a tire, how to stand up straight, how to look people in the eye when speaking to them." "Sounds like military," James observed. 23 years in the army. He never talked much about Vietnam, though, not until near the end. James nodded, understanding in his eyes. Some things are hard to put into words, harder still to tell family. A comfortable silence fell between them. Through the window, streetlights reflected in puddles, creating islands of light in the darkness. Shanice noticed a plastic bag poking out from James's coat pocket, stuffed with what looked like all his belongings. "Where you headed tonight?" she asked carefully. James stiffened slightly. Pride flickered across his face, then resignation. "There's a spot under the highway bridge. Dry enough." Shanice felt her heart sink. The temperature was dropping, and the rain showed no sign of letting up. "That's a long walk in this weather." James shrugged. "Been sleeping rough since February. You get used to it." "February? That's..." Shanice counted in her head. 8 months. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" James took a sip of coffee before answering. "Apartment building caught fire. Nothing suspicious, just old wiring. Lost everything except what I could grab on the way out." He gestured to his bag. "Had a small pension, but medical bills ate that up years ago. Been making do with odd jobs, but they're harder to come by at my age." He spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity. That made it all the more heartbreaking. "Have you tried the VA? My grandpa always said they..." "Paperwork," James interrupted, a flash of frustration crossing his face. "Forms and more forms. Appointments you have to make online when I don't even own a computer. Waiting rooms that..." He trailed off, his eyes momentarily distant. "Some places I still can't handle. Too many people, too much noise." Shanice understood. Her grandfather had been the same way, jumping at loud noises, avoiding crowded places. He called it his souvenir from the war. "What unit did you serve with?" she asked, changing the subject. James straightened slightly, military bearing returning to his posture. 5th Infantry Division, like I mentioned. 2 tours, 68 to 70. My grandpa was there in 69. Wonder if they ever crossed paths." "What was his name?" "Richard Taylor." Everyone called him Richie. James's eyes widened slightly. "Tall fellow?" dark skin, scar above his right eye. Shanice felt goosebumps rise on her arms. Yes, that's him. The scar was from Bar Fike and Sagan, James finished. Defending some local kid from a drunk Marine. Shanice stared at James in disbelief. You knew my grandpa? James's face softened with memory. Not well, but yes. We were in different companies but ended up on the same patrol a few times. He shook his head slowly. Richie Taylor. He saved our bacon once when we got pinned down near the Cambodian border. Brave man. Tears pricked at Shanice's eyes. It had been years since she'd heard a new story about her grandfather. That sounds like him. From across the diner, Helen called out, Shanice, honey, your food's getting cold. Shanice hadn't ordered anything, but she saw Helen pointing to a plate at the counter, the day special that Helen had set aside for her. The older woman winked. I should eat something, Shanice said, standing. Would you like the special? Meatloaf today. James started to shake his head, but Shanice was already walking away. I'll bring 2 plates, she called over her shoulder. In the kitchen, Frank was putting on his coat. I'm heading out, Shanice. You okay to lock up? Sure thing, Frank. That old fellow got somewhere to go tonight? Frank asked quietly, nodding toward James. Shanice shook her head. Says he's been sleeping under the highway. Frank frowned, reaching into his wallet. He pulled out a 20 and pressed it into Shanice's hand. Get him a cab at least. Weather's turning nasty. Shanice hugged the cook, his gruff exterior hiding a kind heart. Thanks, Frank. As she returned with 2 plates of meatloaf, she noticed Tom Peterson still watching from his corner, his newspaper barely a prop anymore. Something about his intense interest made her uneasy, but she pushed the feeling aside. Tonight was about honoring her grandfather's memory by helping his old war buddy. What she couldn't know was how this simple act of kindness would ripple outward, changing not just one life, but many, including her own. The meatloaf steamed in the cool air of the diner as Shanice set both plates on the table. James stared at the food. Thick slices of meatloaf, mashed potatoes with gravy, and green beans on the side. It was the biggest meal he'd seen in months. I can't accept this, he said quietly, even as his stomach growled loud enough for Shanice to hear. I don't have enough for. It's on me, Shanice interrupted, sliding back into the booth across from him. Consider it a thank you for serving with my grandpa. James looked up, his eyes suddenly shiny. I can't let you do that. You work hard for your money. Shanice picked up her fork, signaling that the discussion was over. So did you, Mr. Wilson. Now eat before it gets cold. For a moment, James didn't move. Then slowly, with deliberate care, he picked up his own fork. His first bite was small, cautious, as if he was afraid the food might disappear. The second bite was bigger. By the third, he was eating with the focused attention of someone who had gone too long without a proper meal. The rain drummed steadily on the roof as they ate. Helen had dimmed the lights in the empty sections of the diner, creating a cozy island around their booth. Tom Peterson had finally folded his newspaper and moved to the counter, where he nursed a cup of coffee and occasionally glanced their way. This reminds me of a place outside of Sagan, James said after a while. Local woman ran it. Best food I ever had. She'd feed any soldier who walked in, whether they had money or not. He pushed a bit of meatloaf through the gravy. Some kindnesses stick with you forever. Shanice nodded, thinking of all the little kindnesses that had helped her along the way. Neighbors watching May for free when Shanice picked up extra shifts, professors who gave her extensions when May got sick, even the regular customer who had paid for her textbooks last semester. My grandpa used to say that kindness is the only thing worth passing on, she said. Everything else just collects dust. James smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes and smoothed some of the hard lines in his face. Sounds like Richie. He was always sharing his rations with the new guys, looking out for everyone. As they ate, James gradually opened up more about Vietnam. He told stories about the heat that never let up, the friendships formed in impossible situations, the way they'd all looked out for each other. He spoke of Richie Taylor with respect, describing how her grandfather had kept everyone's spirits up with jokes and stories about home. He talked about his little girl all the time, James said. That would have been your mother, I guess. Shanice nodded. She was only 4 when he went overseas. He carried her picture everywhere. Showed it to anyone who'd look. James shook his head slowly. When things got bad, he'd take out that photo. Kept him going. Shanice felt a lump in her throat. Her mother had died young, when Shanice was only 10, and her grandfather had raised her afterward. He'd been her rock, her safety. Finding someone who remembered him from those faraway days felt like a gift. As they finished eating, Shanice noticed James occasionally rubbing his knee, wincing slightly. "Old war injury?" she asked. He nodded. "Shrapnel. Most of it's still in there. Doctors said it would do more harm than good to take it all out." He gave a half smile. "Tells me when weather's coming better than any meteorologist." Shanice thought of her grandfather's limp that had worsened with age, how he never complained, but always kept a bottle of pain pills nearby. "My break's long over," she said, standing to clear their plates. "But I'm glad we got to talk." James looked around, suddenly remembering they were in a restaurant about to close. "I should get going. You folks want to get home." "It's still pouring out there," Shanice said, glancing at the window where rain streamed down in sheets. The thought of him walking to that spot under the bridge made her stomach clench. At the counter, Helen was counting out her tips, pretending not to listen. Tom Peterson had disappeared into the restroom, leaving his newspaper behind. "Let me pack you something for later," Shanice said suddenly, taking their plates to the kitchen before James could protest. In the back, she quickly packed a container with the remaining meatloaf from the warming tray, added extra mashed potatoes and the last piece of apple pie. It would have been tomorrow's lunch for her, but she could make do with a peanut butter sandwich. When she returned, James was standing awkwardly by the booth, his thin jacket already zipped up, his few belongings tucked into his plastic bag. "Here," she said, handing him the container. "Just something for later." James took the food with careful hands. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," Shanice replied. Then, making a decision, she pulled out her tips from the day, about $50, and counted out 20. "Take this too. For a room tonight. It's too wet out there." James shook his head firmly. "No. The food is more than enough." "Please," Shanice insisted. "My grandpa would never forgive me if I let his war buddy sleep in the rain." Their eyes met in a silent battle of wills. Finally, James reached out and took the money, his weathered hand trembling slightly. "I'll pay you back," he said with quiet dignity. "Somehow." "Just stay dry tonight," Shanice answered. "That's payment enough." As she walked into the door, she noticed Tom Peterson had returned and was watching them intently. Something about his expression had changed, a softness around his eyes, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The streets glistened under the streetlights, and the air smelled clean and fresh. "The motel 2 blocks down is decent," Shanice said, pointing east. "Tell Mr. Patel that Shanice sent you. He might even give you a discount." James nodded, clutching his bag of food and the $20 that represented Shanice's lunch money for the next week. "Thank you," he said simply. Then, straightening his shoulders with military precision, he added, "Your grandfather would be proud of the woman you've become." With those words, he turned and walked slowly down the wet sidewalk, his slight limp more pronounced in the cold night air. What Shanice didn't know as she watched him go was that her simple act of kindness had been witnessed by someone with the power to change both their lives forever. After James left, Shanice stood for a moment in the doorway, watching his slow, careful steps fade into the misty night. Something about their conversation had touched her deeply, perhaps the connection to her grandfather, or maybe just the reminder that everyone has a story worth hearing. "That was a good thing you did," a voice said behind her. Shanice turned to find Tom Peterson standing there, his newspaper tucked under his arm. Up close, she noticed details she'd missed before: the neat haircut, the expensive watch partially hidden under his sleeve, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. "Anyone would have done the same," she said, embarrassed at being caught in her moment of kindness. Tom smiled softly. "No, they wouldn't. That's why it matters." He extended his hand. "Tom Peterson. I've been sitting over there trying not to be obvious about watching you too." Shanice shook his hand cautiously. "Shanice Taylor. Can I help you with something, Mr. Peterson?" "I think maybe I can help you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Shanice. "I work with the Veterans Support Alliance. We help connect vets like your friend James with services they need." Shanice looked down at the card. Under Tom's name was the title Program Director and the VSA logo, a simple shield with stars. I'm also a retired Army colonel, Tom added, 26 years of service. Shanice's eyebrows rose. You're military too. Tom nodded. That's why I noticed your friend right away. You develop an eye for spotting fellow soldiers, something in the posture, the way they scan a room. He glanced toward the door where James had disappeared. Vietnam era, right? Yes, 5th Infantry. He served with my grandfather. Small world. Tom's expression grew more serious. How long has he been on the streets? 8 months, Shanice replied, leading Tom back inside as Helen began turning off the front lights. Lost everything in an apartment fire. Tom shook his head. Too common a story. Many vets fall through the cracks in the system, especially from that era. The paperwork can be overwhelming, particularly for those dealing with PTSD or other issues. Shanice thought of James's comments about forms and crowded waiting rooms. He mentioned something about that. As Helen locked the front door, she called over, You okay closing up the rest, Shanice? I need to get home to give Floyd his medication. No problem, Helen. I'll finish up. When Helen had gone, Shanice began wiping down the counters while Tom took a seat at the nearest booth. I hope you don't mind me saying, Tom began, but that was quite a sacrifice you made tonight. The meal, the money. Shanice shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with the praise. It wasn't much. To him, it was everything. And I noticed you gave him money from your own tips. That's not just kindness, that's sacrifice. Shanice focused on cleaning, not meeting Tom's eyes. I've been in tight spots before. People helped me. You pass it on when you can. The diner was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerators and the rhythmic sound of Shanice's cloth against the countertop. Outside, cars occasionally splashed through puddles, their headlights briefly illuminating the wet windows. Do you mind if I ask what your situation is? Tom asked gently. I notice you're working late hours, and that textbook in your bag suggests you are studying. Shanice paused her cleaning. Normally, she didn't share much with strangers, but something about Tom's manner invited trust. I'm in nursing school, she said, part-time program while working full-time here. I have a 5-year-old daughter, May. We make it work. Tom nodded thoughtfully. That can't be easy. School, work, single parent, juggling it all. We get by. Shanice moved to the next table, wiping it down with practiced efficiency. May's a good kid, doesn't ask for much. And yet you gave money to James that I'm guessing you could have used yourself. Shanice stopped cleaning and looked directly at Tom. Mr. Peterson, what exactly are you getting at? Tom held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. Nothing bad, I promise. I'm just impressed, and maybe a little curious about what motivated such generosity. Shanice considered her answer, thinking back to James's stories about her grandfather. My grandpa always said we're measured by what we do when no one's watching. I guess I wanted to measure up. Tom smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. Well, someone was watching, and I think we might be able to help both you and James. He pulled out his phone and showed Shanice a photo he'd discreetly taken, James sitting at the table, the veteran's tattoo visible on his arm. With your permission, I'd like to look into James's case. The VSA has resources to help veterans like him get back on their feet. Housing assistance, medical care, benefits they're entitled to but might not know how to access. Shanice felt a flicker of hope. He'd be too proud to accept charity. It's not charity, Tom said firmly. It's what he earned. What he's owed for his service. As Shanice finished cleaning, Tom made a few quiet phone calls. She caught fragments, mentions of James's name, questions about available housing, something about medical services. Finally, as Shanice was hanging up her apron, Tom approached again. I've set some things in motion for James. My colleagues will try to connect with him at that motel tomorrow. Thank you, Shanice said sincerely. That's wonderful. Tom hesitated, then added, There's something else. The VSA has a scholarship program for family members of veterans who are pursuing careers in healthcare. Your grandfather's service would qualify you. Shanice stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. A scholarship. It wouldn't cover everything, but it could significantly reduce your financial burden. Let me take your contact information, and I'll send you the application tomorrow. As they exchanged information, Shanice felt a strange mixture of emotions: hope, gratitude, and a lingering disbelief that a chance encounter could lead to such possibility. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the streets quiet and glistening. Tom offered Shanice a ride home, which she gratefully accepted, thinking of the long bus ride she'd been facing. In his car, a comfortable silence fell between them. Tom finally broke it by saying, "You know, in the military, we have a saying, 'No good deed goes unnoticed.'" Shanice smiled, thinking of James and hoping he was warm and dry in the motel. "I wasn't looking for anyone to notice." "That's exactly why it matters," Tom replied, turning onto their street. "The best kind of kindness expects nothing in return." What neither of them knew was that Tom's phone calls had set in motion events far beyond what either could imagine. Events that would bring the full weight of military recognition to honor not just James's service, but Shanice's simple act of compassion. Morning came with golden sunshine that made the puddles glitter like scattered coins. Shanice had slept poorly, her mind replaying the encounter with James and Tom's surprising offer. She told May a simplified version of a breakfast, and her daughter had listened with wide eyes. "You helped Grandpa's friend?" May had asked, milk dribbling down her chin. "That's like in my storybook when the princess helps the old wizard." Shanice had smiled, wiping May's face. "Something like that, baby." Now, as she hurried toward Molly's diner for her early shift, Shanice wondered if she'd see James again. Had he found the motel? Would Tom's colleagues really be able to help him? The scholarship possibility seemed too good to be true, and she tried not to get her hopes up. The morning rush at the diner was the usual blur of coffee refills, pancake orders, and friendly chatter with the regulars. By 10:30, things had slowed down enough for Shanice to catch her breath. She was refilling salt shakers when Helen nudged her. "There's somebody outside you should see," the older woman said, nodding toward the window. Shanice looked up and nearly dropped the salt container. 3 military vehicles were parked in front of the diner, 2 olive green SUVs with government plates, and an official-looking black car. Men and women in crisp uniforms were stepping out, adjusting their caps in the bright morning light. "What on earth?" Shanice whispered. The door chimed, and Tom Peterson walked in, dressed not in yesterday's casual clothes, but in a formal military uniform adorned with ribbons and medals. Behind him came 4 other officers, equally well decorated. The diner fell silent as customers turned to stare. Even Frank poked his head out from the kitchen, spatula in hand. "Good morning, Shanice," Tom said with a warm smile. "I hope we're not interrupting your work day too much." Shanice stood frozen, salt shaker still in hand. "Colonel Peterson? What is all this?" Tom gestured to the officers behind him. "These are some colleagues who wanted to meet you, and James Wilson, if he's here." "James? No, I haven't seen him since last night." Tom nodded as if he'd expected this. "We found him. He's waiting outside, actually. We wanted to surprise both of you." A mixture of confusion and curiosity washed over Shanice's face. Helen gently took the salt shaker from her hands and whispered, "Go on, honey. I'll cover your tables." Outside, the morning sun was bright enough to make Shanice squint. Standing beside one of the military vehicles was James Wilson, but a transformed James Wilson. Gone were the tattered clothes and weary slump. He stood straight in clean pants and a button-up shirt, his gray hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed. His eyes widened when he saw Shanice. "There she is," he said, a smile breaking across his weathered face. "The angel who saved me." Shanice approached cautiously, aware of the small crowd of onlookers gathering on the sidewalk. "James, aren't you okay? What's happening?" Before he could answer, a woman officer stepped forward. "Miss Taylor, I'm Major Lisa Daniels. After Colonel Peterson contacted us last night about Mr. Wilson, we did some research that led to a remarkable discovery." Tom joined them, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "James Wilson isn't just any veteran. He's a decorated hero whose service record was incomplete due to administrative errors during the chaotic final years of the Vietnam conflict." Major Daniels nodded. "When we located Mr. Wilson at the motel this morning and confirmed his identity, we discovered that he had been recommended for a Silver Star that was never processed. The paperwork was misfiled and only recently discovered during our ongoing digitization efforts." James looked down, uncomfortable with the attention. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. "Your unit was ambushed," Tom continued gently. "According to the reports, you carried 2 wounded men to safety under heavy fire, then returned to provide covering fire so others could retreat." Shanice stared at James with new understanding. The quiet, humble man who had counted pennies for coffee had once been a battlefield hero. "We're here to correct a wrong that's been decades in the making," Major Daniels said, "and to thank you, Ms. Taylor, for your kindness to a man who served his country with exceptional valor." By now, a small crowd had gathered, diner customers, passing pedestrians, even Helen and Frank, who had stepped outside to watch. Someone began to clap, and soon everyone joined in. James looked overwhelmed, his eyes darting as if searching for escape. Shanice recognized the signs from her grandfather, the discomfort with loud noises and crowds. "Can we go inside?" she asked quietly. "I think Mr. Wilson might be more comfortable with fewer people around." Tom noticed James's distress immediately and nodded. "Of course, we've arranged a small private ceremony, if that's all right." Back inside the diner, Frank had cleared a space and Helen had put out fresh coffee. The military officers arranged themselves in a small semicircle while regular customers watched curiously from their booths. "James Wilson," Tom began formally, "on behalf of a grateful nation, I present you with the Silver Star for gallantry in action against enemies of the United States." He opened a small blue box to reveal a silver star hanging from a red, white, and blue ribbon. With careful movements, he pinned it to James's shirt. The older man stood ramrod straight, tears glistening in his eyes but not falling. "Thank you, sir," James said, his voice steady despite the emotion on his face. Major Daniels stepped forward with a folder. "Additionally, we've processed paperwork to connect you with all VA benefits you're entitled to. You'll have access to housing assistance, medical care, and your full military pension with back payments for the benefits you should have been receiving." James looked stunned, as if unable to process the sudden reversal of his fortunes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept the help," Shanice whispered, standing beside him. "You earned it." James nodded slowly, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. "I will." Tom turned to Shanice, his expression warm. "And now for our second purpose today. Ms. Taylor, your act of kindness to a veteran in need exemplifies the very best of American values. The Veterans Support Alliance would like to offer you a full scholarship to complete your nursing education." The diner erupted in applause. Frank whistled through his fingers, and Helen wiped tears from her eyes. "Full scholarship?" Shanice repeated, certain she had misheard. "But yesterday you mentioned a partial." "The committee met this morning and voted unanimously to make it a full scholarship after hearing your story. Your compassion, despite your own struggles, moved everyone deeply." Shanice felt her legs go weak. A full scholarship would change everything. No more double shifts, more time with May, the ability to complete her degree faster. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, echoing James's words from the night before. Tom smiled. "Just finish your education and keep being the person you are. That's thanks enough." What had begun as an ordinary rainy evening had turned into something extraordinary. A long overdue recognition, a life pulled back from the brink, and a dream suddenly within reach. And it had all started with a simple cup of coffee and a meal shared with a stranger. The rest of the day felt like a dream to Shanice. After the ceremony at the diner, Tom had insisted she take the day off. Helen had practically pushed her out the door, saying, "Go on, honey. Some days are too special for serving coffee." Now, Shanice sat in a downtown office building, watching as James spoke with VA representatives who were helping him fill out paperwork. The transformation in him was remarkable. Though still quiet, he carried himself differently, with dignity restored, shoulders straight, eyes clear and focused. "Miss Taylor." A woman touched her arm gently. "We have your scholarship paperwork ready if you'd like to review it." Shanice followed her to a small conference room where Tom waited with several folders. As she took a seat, he slid the top folder toward her. "Everything's here. Tuition, books, even a monthly stipend for living expenses," he explained. "The committee was quite moved by your story. Several members have pledged personal donations to expand the program for other students." Shanice opened the folder with trembling hands. The numbers she saw made her breath catch. It was more than she dared hope for. With this support, she could cut back her work hours, focus on her studies, and still have time for May. "I don't understand," she said softly. "All this because I bought a man dinner?" Tom leaned forward, his expression serious. "Not just dinner, Shanice. You saw his humanity when others looked past him. You connected with him personally when most people would have kept their distance. You shared what little you had when it would have been easier not to." He gestured toward the window, where James could be seen talking with a counselor across the hall. "And in doing so, you helped us find a man who had fallen through the cracks, a hero who deserved recognition, but instead was sleeping under a bridge." A knock at the door interrupted them. A young woman poked her head in. "Colonel, the press is here. They're setting up in the main conference room." Tom nodded, then looked questioningly at Shanice. "We'd like to share the story with the local news, if you're comfortable with that. No pressure, though." Shanice hesitated. She'd never sought attention, and being in front of cameras made her nervous. But something about the situation felt important, bigger than just her and James. "Will it help other veterans?" she asked. "Absolutely," Tom replied. "Stories like this raise awareness, encourage others to get involved, and remind veterans that they're not forgotten." Shanice nodded slowly. "Then yes, I'll do it." The press conference was small but earnest. 2 local news stations and a newspaper reporter listened as Tom explained about finding James and discovering his unprocessed silver star. James spoke briefly, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort with the attention. When it was Shanice's turn, she smoothed her waitress uniform nervously and stepped to the microphone. "I didn't do anything special," she began. "My grandfather was a Vietnam veteran too. He always taught me that we're connected to each other and that kindness matters. I just did what he would have done." A reporter raised her hand. "Did you know about the scholarship program when you helped Mr. Wilson?" Shanice shook her head. "No. I didn't expect anything in return." "That's what makes it remarkable," Tom added, joining her at the microphone. "In today's world, true compassion without expectation of reward is something to celebrate." After the interviews, as they walked back to the VA offices, James fell into step beside Shanice. "I never properly thanked you," he said quietly. "Not just for the food, but for seeing me, really seeing me." Shanice smiled. "My grandpa would have been glad I found you. It feels like his way of still looking out for me somehow." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I start my housing placement tomorrow. They found a veterans apartment complex with supportive services." "That's wonderful," Shanice said sincerely. "And you? What will you do with your scholarship?" "Finish my degree faster, spend more time with my daughter. Maybe finally buy those new shoes I've been putting off." She laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Later that afternoon, as Shanice waited for the bus to pick up May from school, her phone buzzed with a text from Helen. "Turn on Channel 7 News right now." Shanice ducked into a nearby coffee shop just in time to see herself on the television mounted on the wall. The story had made the evening news. The caption read, "Waitress's act of kindness changes veteran's life." People in the coffee shop turned to look at the screen, several nodding in approval at the story. An older man wiped his eyes discreetly. A young barista behind the counter whispered to her coworker, "See, good people still exist." When Shanice stepped off the bus with May, she was surprised to find neighbors waiting outside their apartment building. Mrs. Patel from next door rushed forward. "We saw you on the news," she exclaimed. The whole building was watching. May looked up, confused. "Mommy, why aren't you on TV?" Shanice knelt down to her daughter's level. "Remember the man I told you about? Grandpa's friend?" The story got shared so other people could help veterans too. That night, their small apartment filled with neighbors bringing food and congratulations. May proudly told everyone how her mom was famous for being nice, a description that made Shanice both laugh and tear up. After everyone left and May was tucked in bed, Shanice sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is James. Tom helped me get a phone. Just wanted to say I start physical therapy tomorrow. First time in years. Thank you again." She smiled as she texted back, "That's great news. Take care of yourself." 1 week later, Shanice walked into her nursing class without the weight of financial worry for the first time. Her classmates, who had also seen the news, greeted her with warm smiles and questions. At the diner, customers sometimes recognized her and left extra-large tips with notes saying, "Pay it forward," or "For your daughter." Shanice kept a jar for these unexpected gifts, planning to create a small scholarship fund for other students when she graduated. James called weekly with updates. He was reconnecting with his sister after years of silence, attending therapy for his PTSD, and had even started volunteering at the VA, helping other veterans navigate the system that had once seemed so overwhelming to him. And every time Shanice passed someone on the street who looked down on their luck, she remembered the lesson that had changed her life. Sometimes the smallest gesture, a meal, a conversation, simple human dignity, could set in motion ripples that changed many lives. The key was simply to begin.